Have you ever felt something like, let's imagine this. You're sitting across from someone you love, someone you've trusted for years. They smile, speak kindly, laugh at the right moments. Everything appears normal. And yet, something doesn't sit right. Their presence feels hollow, as though they're reciting lines from a forgotten script. You ask a simple question, nothing confrontational, just curious. And suddenly their face hardens. They accuse you of things you never said. They twist your words. They explode. You're left stunned, confused, even shaken. You think, where did that come from? But the better question is, who did that come from? And an even deeper question lingers, darker and far more disturbing. What if it came from you? There's a peculiar danger that walks beside us every day. Quiet, camouflaged, and invisible to the naked eye. It doesn't wear a mask. It is the mask. It doesn't break through the surface. It lives underneath it. This danger isn't found in sociopaths or criminals alone. In fact, it thrives most powerfully in the so-called good and normal. People like you, people like me, people who believe they are self-aware, moral, and in control. Carl Jung called it the shadow, the part of ourselves we refuse to see. But even more dangerous than the shadow itself is what we do with it. We don't just ignore it. We project it. And when we do, we begin to live in a waking dream. A distorted mirror world where we believe others are cruel, manipulative, selfish, arrogant, or toxic, not realizing that these are our own rejected traits flung violently onto the canvas of the world. This is called shadow projection, and according to Jung, it is not just a psychological glitch, it is a spiritual sickness, a silent poison, a socially acceptable form of madness. But here's the paradox. The more convinced you are of your own goodness, the more violently your shadow will fight for survival. The more certain you are that you are right, the more power your projections will have to destroy. You might look at a stranger and feel hatred rise in your throat for their arrogance, their pride, their weakness, their flamboyance. You might lash out at someone for a trait you pretend you don't have. You might push away those who mirror back the things you deny. And all the while, you'll tell yourself that they are the problem. Because the mind has one sacred rule: protect the ego at all costs. We've all heard the phrase, know thyself. But what if we misunderstood it? What if knowing yourself doesn't just mean knowing your values, your goals, or your dreams, but also knowing your darkest potential? The parts of you you swore you'd never be. The liar, the manipulator, the coward, the aggressor, the seducer, the traitor. Most people don't want to find these parts. They want to believe they are nice, or pure, or healed. But in trying so hard to be good, they become dangerous. Not because of what they do, but because of what they refuse to see. Jung warned, the most dangerous psychological mistake is the projection of the shadow onto others. Why? Because it creates a false enemy, a phantom to be fought, shamed, controlled, or eliminated, not realizing that the battlefield isn't outside, but within. The world begins to reflect not reality, but our own inner war. You don't just fear the narcissist, you see one in every room. You don't just want justice, you crave punishment. You don't just avoid toxicity, you radiate it, unknowingly. This is the paradox that should make you pause. The more you try to be good without facing your shadow, the more harm you unconsciously cause. So the question is not, am I projecting? The question is, where? When? And how deeply? Because you are. We all are. And the most dangerous people are the ones who insist they aren't. What if the toxic relationship you're in is built on two shadows, dancing with daggers behind masks of victimhood and virtue? What if your outrage at the world isn't just righteous, it's displaced rage you never dared to feel? What if the people who trigger you most are offering you an accidental mirror? This isn't comfortable. It's not meant to be. The truth never asks for permission. It only waits for your attention. And once you give it, you can never unsee what it reveals. So if you dare, follow this question to its edge. What part of yourself have you never dared to meet? And how many people have you unknowingly punished for it? Because until you do, the shadow will speak through your mouth. It will live through your choices. It will sabotage your peace, and you'll call it fate. You may think you know yourself, but your shadow knows you better, and it is tired of being ignored. So why do we do it? Why do we, without knowing, project our darkness onto others? Why do we see enemies where there are none? Why does the mind, brilliant and capable as it is, engage in such a subtle form of self-deception? The answer lies buried beneath layers of psychological armor and philosophical terror. The answer is ancient. The answer is uncomfortable. And it starts with a single idea. You were never taught to hold your darkness. From the moment you were born, you were taught what to be, but not what to do with what you are. You were praised for being quiet, punished for being loud, rewarded for being polite, shamed for being angry. You were told to forgive quickly, apologize often, smile kindly, share everything. And so, bit by bit, your shadow was born. You disowned what was inconvenient. You buried what was wild. You learned that in order to survive, socially, emotionally, existentially, you must amputate parts of your humanity. But the psyche is not a machine. It doesn't delete, it hides. And what is hidden does not rest, it rebels. Carl Jung said, "To become conscious of the shadow is to realize that the enemy is not out there but in here." But consciousness is terrifying, because to become truly conscious is to accept that you are not just the hero of your story, but also the saboteur, the coward, the betrayer, the tyrant. And no one wants to meet those eyes in the mirror. We live in a culture obsessed with light, personal growth, good vibes, positivity, spiritual bypassing, hyperproductivity, all wrapped in the language of virtue. We call it wellness, we call it progress. But often, it is just avoidance dressed in self-improvement. Philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche saw this with piercing clarity. He warned, "Whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process, he does not become a monster. And if you gaze long enough into an abyss, the abyss will gaze back into you." But what if the opposite is also true? What if refusing to gaze into the abyss ensures that it never stops gazing into you? Because here's the brutal irony. The more you suppress the shadow, the more power you give it. What you exile doesn't dissolve. It grows claws. And when the unconscious builds enough pressure, it breaks through, not as insight but as projection. It speaks in judgment. It screams in moral outrage. It surfaces in gossip, in blame, in us versus them, in tribalism. The more intense your reaction to another human being, the more likely your shadow is speaking. It becomes easy, even pleasurable, to hate, because hate feels righteous. Hate feels clarifying. Hate tells you who you are not. And in a world terrified of ambiguity, that's intoxicating. Thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Viktor Frankl explored this existential dilemma. Sartre reminded us that we are condemned to be free, free to choose, free to become, free to confront what we are. But freedom terrifies us. It leaves us naked. And so we look for shields, identities, ideologies, narratives that relieve us from the burden of self-confrontation. Frankl, a Holocaust survivor and psychiatrist, went further. In Man's Search for Meaning, he wrote, "When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. But most people don't want that challenge, so they change their reality instead. They create illusions, sometimes spiritual, sometimes political, sometimes personal, to protect the fragile ego. And no illusion is more dangerous than the belief, I am good. Others are not. That belief is the birthplace of projection. It is also the birthplace of cruelty. This is why Carl Jung believed that the greatest threat to humanity is not evil in its raw form, but evil disguised as virtue. The inquisitor who burns in the name of truth, the revolutionary who kills in the name of justice, the therapist who harms in the name of healing, the parent who shames in the name of love. The shadow so projected is a weapon sharpened by righteousness. But this isn't just psychological, it's neurological. Modern neuroscience reveals that our brains are built for shortcuts, heuristics designed to keep us safe. These shortcuts form biases: confirmation bias, in-group bias, negativity bias. They shape perception long before awareness catches up. The brain does not ask, is this true? It asks, does this fit my identity? And if your identity is built on being not like them, then you must constantly find them to stay yourself. That's why projection becomes addictive. It maintains the ego by outsourcing its flaws. But projection doesn't just distort individuals. It builds entire systems. When a culture is afraid of vulnerability, it mocks emotional expression. When a religion is afraid of desire, it condemns sexuality. When a society is afraid of its own violence, it criminalizes the other. Philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer once suggested that the deepest form of cruelty stems not from hatred, but from fear. The fear of seeing ourselves in others. To prevent that mirror from cracking, we destroy the reflection. This is shadow projection at scale, and it is the silent architect of oppression, racism, war, and generational trauma. For the scariest part, it always feels justified, because projection is not conscious, it's not strategic, it's reflexive. That's what makes it so dangerous. It feels like instinct, it feels like truth, but it is not truth, it is disowned identity in camouflage. Which brings us to the most unsettling possibility. You may not know who you truly are. Not because you haven't searched deeply, but because parts of you were exiled before they could speak. Parts of you were buried not with hatred, but with love. Love that wanted you to be accepted. Love that said, don't be angry, or don't be selfish, or don't be different. But wholeness is not the absence of darkness. It is the integration of it. And until that integration happens, the shadow will continue to live in exile, vomited out onto others, fueling a war that has nothing to do with them. So now the deeper question emerges, not just, am I projecting, but what have I sacrificed to appear good? And what might happen if I stopped pretending? What might happen if I listened to the voice I've silenced all these years? You're close to finding out. But before that, you need to understand how projection isn't just a hidden psychological reflex, but a living force, shaping everything you touch. Because next, we explore the unseen consequences, the silent, sinister outcomes of a life lived through a cracked mirror. You can't see it, you can't touch it, but it touches everything. It changes the way you look at people before they've even spoken. It rewrites your memory, bending the past until you become the hero of every conflict. It whispers in your inner dialogue, tinting every emotion, every judgment, every reaction. This is the quiet empire of the projected shadow. It doesn't shout, it shapes. And what it shapes first is your perception. Your eyes no longer see people. They scan for threats, flaws, confirmations of what your unconscious has already decided. You begin to trust your gut more than your curiosity, not because you're intuitive, but because your mind is filtering reality through a lens built by fear, pain, or buried shame. You don't see them. You see the version of them your ego needs to see to protect itself. This is why two people can meet the same individual and walk away with entirely different impressions. One sees arrogance, the other sees confidence. One sees manipulation, the other sees charm. They're not describing the person. They're describing their projection onto the person. But the consequences of this distortion go deeper than social discomfort. It corrodes the inner life. It makes relationships shallow. It turns intimacy into suspicion, dialogue into defense, and connection into combat. Let's say you were raised in a household where anger was forbidden. Not managed, forbidden. Whenever you got upset, you were told to calm down, be quiet, be good. Over time, you learned to suppress that fire. But the fire didn't go away. It moved underground. Now, as an adult, you flinch when someone raises their voice. Not because they're being abusive, but because your own buried anger is knocking on the walls of your psyche, demanding to be felt. But instead of feeling it, you project it. They're too much. They're aggressive. They're unstable. And you don't just avoid them. You resent them for carrying the energy you have denied yourself. The projection protects you from facing what you were never allowed to feel. But here's the cost. You begin to fear your own fire, and anyone who reminds you of it. This doesn't just alter relationships. It fragments your identity. It divides you into fragments. The part you perform and the part you exile. And that split, though silent, is exhausting. You feel it in the fatigue that has no medical cause, in the anxiety that spikes in quiet moments, in the hollow ache that whispers, "This isn't all of me." The consequences extend beyond the individual. When projection becomes normalized, it spreads through culture like a virus. Think of politics. The enemy is not just someone with different ideas. They're now a caricature, a demon, a symbolic container for everything you hate, fear, or refuse to acknowledge within yourself. You don't just want to disagree, you want to see them lose, suffer, disappear. Your projection has dehumanized them, and in doing so has dehumanized you. This is how wars begin, not on battlefields, but in minds unwilling to see themselves fully. Shadow projection fuels racism, xenophobia, misogyny, and fanaticism. It tells a man he must dominate because he's terrified of his own helplessness. It tells a society to ban books because it fears the chaos of unapproved thought. It tells the moral crusader to burn witches, real or symbolic, so they never have to face their own dark hunger for power. The most dangerous ideologies aren't those that admit darkness, they are those that claim to have none. Even in your personal life, projection can shape your destiny. A child who watches a parent repress sadness may grow up fearing vulnerability, but since sadness is natural, it must go somewhere. So it gets projected outward. That person is weak, or that friend is too emotional. And thus begins a life of superficial relationships, emotional avoidance, and quiet self-betrayal. And what about love? Projection creates false intimacy. You fall in love not with a person, but with the idealized reflection of your unacknowledged traits. The confident lover who gives voice to your suppressed boldness. The nurturing partner who tends the wounds you pretend aren't there. But here's the thing. Projections fade. And when they do, you feel betrayed. They changed. No, they didn't. Your illusion did. That's why so many relationships collapse not from conflict, but from awakening. You didn't fall out of love. You fell out of projection. Shadow projection also corrupts your decision-making. Say you want to start something bold, a business, an art form, a reinvention. But part of you fears failure, rejection, or being seen. Instead of facing that fear, you project it outward. People won't get it. Society isn't ready. Others are just more talented. And thus, your dream dies, not from lack of potential, but from unexamined fear wearing the mask of logic. Even spirituality isn't immune. In fact, it's often worse. People project their shadow onto gurus, religions, or negative energy. They see darkness everywhere. Curses, evil spirits, karmic attachments, never realizing they're describing their own denied rage, shame, or guilt. Shadow work becomes a trend, a checkbox, a slogan, but it was never meant to be clean. The shadow is not aesthetic. It is apocalyptic, in the truest sense of the word, an unveiling. And until that unveiling happens, the consequences continue, unseen, unspoken, unstoppable. Because the shadow doesn't care how woke you are, how successful you are, how healed you appear. It only cares about one thing, being seen. Until then, it will keep turning your life into a theater. One where you play every role, victim, savior, villain, and forget that you wrote the script. So ask yourself, how many of your enemies are really memories? How many of your judgments are old wounds in disguise? How much of your life has been lived in reaction to what you've never allowed yourself to feel? These questions are not comfortable, but they are the beginning of liberation, because once you see the pattern, you can break it, and in the breaking, something extraordinary can begin. But breaking is painful. Rebellion is terrifying. Awakening requires that you not just question the world, you must question yourself. So next, we enter the fourth movement of this journey, the part where you stop pretending, where you stop projecting, and where you finally begin to reclaim what was never truly lost. It begins not with thunder, not with fire, but with a whisper that says, I'm done. Done blaming, done reacting, done exiling parts of yourself to survive in a world that rewards masks more than truth. This is not a gentle awakening. It is a psychological mutiny. Because the moment you realize your suffering was partly authored by your own projections, you have a choice that most people will never dare to make. You can continue the performance, or you can walk off the stage. But understand, rebellion doesn't feel like freedom at first. It feels like dying, because in a way it is. When you begin to withdraw your projections, what returns to you is not pretty. What returns is what you've spent years trying to suppress: rage, shame, jealousy, lust, fear, grief. And this is where most turn back. They call it too much. They say, I'm not ready. But what they really mean is, I don't want to meet the parts of myself I've been taught to hate. So let this be clear. Breaking free means meeting your shadow with open eyes. Not to indulge it, not to act it out, but to witness it, to integrate it, to finally say, you are me, and I will no longer abandon you. Carl Jung said, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. That is the work. That is the rebellion. And it is not done in silence. It is done in fury and grace. You will grieve the person you pretended to be. You will question every belief that once gave you comfort. You will learn to sit in emotional pain without numbing it, blaming it, or projecting it onto others. And in that sitting, something ancient stirs. Something primal, untamed, holy. You will begin to remember yourself. Not the curated identity, not the adaptive persona, but the one who existed before the conditioning, the one who was not yet afraid to feel, to speak, to want. But how do you begin? Start here. 1. Catch the projection mid-sentence. The next time you find yourself aggressively judging someone, pause. Don't repress the thought, just ask, what part of myself am I seeing in them? Is it their arrogance, their neediness, their chaos? Now, ask, when have I been that way and shamed myself for it? You'll find something, if you're honest. Projection is rarely about the other. It's a mirror, distorted by fear, memory, and exile. 2. Create a shadow journal. This is not your regular diary. This is where you confess the truths that scare you. What do I envy in others? What traits do I deny in myself? What would I do if no one was watching and there were no consequences? You will not like some of the answers. That's the point. This isn't about liking yourself, it's about knowing yourself. Because love without knowledge is fantasy, and knowledge without love is cruelty. Shadow integration is both. 3. Interrupt the reaction loop. Every time you react strongly, especially with disgust, superiority, or self-righteousness, pause. Don't trust the story immediately. Sit in the emotion first. Ask, is this about them or about a part of me I refuse to see? Over time, you'll realize how many battles you were fighting outside that actually began inside. 4. Reclaim what you feared. The shadow is not just darkness. It also contains power, sexuality, ambition, creativity, boundaries, all of which may have been punished or shamed in your upbringing. To integrate your shadow is to reclaim what was once taboo. Can you own your hunger without letting it devour others? Can you stand in your anger without becoming a tyrant? Can you express your desire without shame? This is the sacred tension of the rebel. To hold fire without burning down the house. 5. Let go of the need to be good. You were never here to be good. You were here to be whole. And wholeness means embracing contradiction. You are both kind and cruel, noble and petty, divine and animal. When you release the performance of virtue, you make space for real integrity. Because now your choices come not from image but from consciousness. This is freedom. But it is not polite, which is why most systems will resist it. Your family may not understand. Your community may reject it. Even your ego will try to bargain its way back into safety. Let it protest. Because true rebellion means being misunderstood for a while. It means walking alone for a stretch until you find others who have also burned the masks and walked through fire. 6. Find a mirror who doesn't flinch. This work is hard to do alone. Find a therapist, mentor, or friend who can hold space without rescuing you. Someone who doesn't try to fix you when you bleed. Someone who says, I see you, all of you, and I'm still here. Because the most dangerous part of shadow work is not the darkness itself. It's the aloneness we feel when we enter it. But you're not alone. You are in the company of every soul who has chosen truth over comfort. Jung, Nietzsche, Frankl, Buddha, even Christ in Gethsemane, they all walked into the wilderness of the self, and they emerged not as saints, but as humans who had remembered their full range. The rebellion is not against society. It's not even against the ego, it is against forgetfulness. You were born whole, conditioned to fracture, and now you remember. That is the quiet miracle. But the final revelation, the deepest, most searing truth, still awaits, because even as you rebel, even as you reclaim and integrate, one final illusion remains, the illusion of the self itself. To pierce that is to awaken not just psychologically but existentially, and once you do, nothing is the same. Prepare yourself. Because next, we confront the ultimate truth, a reality so intimate, it can no longer be denied. There comes a moment, after the rebellion, after the fire and fragmentation, when silence falls. Not the silence of absence, the silence of presence. You have withdrawn your projections. You've confronted the grotesque and the divine within you. You've met your rage, your shame, your hunger, your buried brilliance. You have faced the shadow, and in doing so, reclaimed your soul. But now, a final question arises, one so radical, so existential that it burns through every prior layer of truth. Who is the one doing all this work? Who is integrating? Who is reclaiming? Who is watching the watcher? In that question lies the doorway to everything, Because the final illusion, the one that keeps all other illusions alive, is the belief in a fixed, permanent self, a solid I that contains all your experiences, emotions, projections, traumas, and triumphs. But if you look closely, ruthlessly, honestly, you will not find this self. It was never more than a story, a psychological mirage constructed out of memory, fear, language, and time, held together by repetition, protected by ego, worshipped by culture. You were never your traits, never your thoughts, not your wounds, not even your healing. You were the field in which all of that happened. What you call me is a constantly changing stream, a river of sensations, preferences, stories, beliefs, and yet, beneath all of it, something watches, something listens. It does not judge, it does not crave, it does not defend. It is, and this is the final, most terrifying liberation. You are not who you think you are. You never were. The projections, the masks, the persona, the shadow, they were all costumes in a dream. And waking up means letting go not just of the mask, but of the one who wore it. Carl Jung hinted at this, though he never fully crossed into mysticism, but others did. The mystics, the sages, the mad poets and silent monks, they all pointed to the same sacred disintegration, that the ego, no matter how healed, is still a veil. Even enlightenment, if clung to as an identity, becomes a prison. Because there is no fixed self to save. There is only presence, consciousness, the great stillness behind the noise. Jean-Paul Sartre said, "Man is nothing else but what he makes of himself." But what if even that is too much? What if you are not even the maker, but the space in which making appears? You are not your story. You are the screen on which the story plays. You are not your thoughts. You are the sky that holds every cloud. And this is not an idea to believe. It is a silence to fall into. The mind will protest. It will try to repackage this as philosophy, theology, or spiritual branding. It will say, "Ah, yes, I am the witness." But the one claiming to be the witness is still the mind. To truly know this truth is not to describe it. It is to fall into it like a death and find that nothing dies. You begin to see that your entire life has been a dance of shadows cast by a light you mistook for the object. You are always reaching toward things, people, roles, ideas, trying to solidify what cannot be held. And now you let go, not passively, not as defeat. You let go the way a bird lets go of a branch when it's time to fly. There is no longer anything to defend because there is no one to defend it, no self-image to protect, no identity to sustain. Only the direct experience of now, raw, unscripted, alive. From this place, even shadow work dissolves. Because the shadow can only exist when there's a self to cast it. When you realize the self is not fixed, the shadow becomes light in disguise. Your flaws, your failures, your darkness, they're no longer threats. They are part of the sacred unfolding. Your triggers become teachers. Your enemies become mirrors. Your life becomes art. Not because you fixed yourself, but because you saw there was never anything broken. Even your suffering was holy. Every heartbreak cracked open a layer of illusion. Every projection was a breadcrumb leading you back to yourself. And now that you are here, what remains? Only this breath, only this moment, only presence, clear and unburdened by narrative. You don't need to become anything anymore, because you already are, not as a thing, but as awareness itself. So what now? You live, but not in the old way, grasping, defending, building psychological monuments. You live like the ocean, fluid, vast, holding everything and clinging to nothing. You speak the truth, not to prove anything, but because truth is all that remains. You love, not as possession or protection, but as recognition. I see you, because I see myself in you. And you serve, Not for validation, but because what else would love do? This is the final turn. This is where the work ends, and life begins anew. Not as someone, but as the space in which everything and nothing arise together. You are free. And this freedom is quiet. It does not demand applause. It does not need to be posted or praised. It simply is. A presence that moves through the world with open eyes, an undefended heart, and a deep, nameless trust in the intelligence of being. You are no longer at war because the enemy never existed. It was always you, trying to come home, and now you have.